Then let's commence. Thank you very much for those of you who have joined us in person today, and thank you very much for those of you who are watching online. My name is James Wilson. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Research Data Architectures for Research Institutions, the slightly clumsily named ARDC interest group. We are going to be focusing today on applying PIDs at the institutional level, so universities, large multidisciplinary research institutes, how we can use PIDs, how we can make the most of it, what the opposition there is to any, the pros and cons, everything else you can possibly imagine. We have a program for the day. We'll start off with just introductions and overview of the interest group for those of you who are not familiar with it already. Rory will come up and just say a little bit about the sort of background PIDs institutions, why we're doing this, why we've chosen to focus on this today. We've got 3 presentations. Not all of the presentations are being delivered by the person who created the slides of the presentations, but hopefully we will do justice to the creators of those slides, and they're very much to kind of whet your appetite and give you some ideas, which we'll then explore in kind of the meat of the session, which is a facilitated group discussion. So what we tend to do in the ARDC session is we try and take a topic which we feel is relevant or becoming relevant for institutions, and really make it a kind of an information sharing session. So hopefully you're all feeling wide awake and not jet lagged, and ready to talk about all the wonderful things that your institution is doing, if it's doing anything. Ask others what kind of pitfalls they're encountering and everything else. And finally, just at the end, we'll tell things off with a little summing up and talk about the next steps. So for those of you unfamiliar, the ARDC interest group, the Research Data Architectures and Research Institutions interest group, is primarily concerned with the technical architectures for managing research data within universities and other multidisciplinary research institutions. It provides insight into the approaches being taken to the development and operation of such architectures and their success or otherwise in enabling good practice. So we actually maybe are slightly less technical than that implies, because we do pay a lot of attention to issues of governance, how such institutions are run, and the kind of ways that this might help or hinder particular development of technical approaches and so forth. But this will be a moderately technical topic today, I think. We've covered a lot of topics in the past, so this is quite a long-running interest group. Basically what we do is we have these kind of conversations about particular topics of interest, and then some of these may be picked up if there's a lot of interest, and taken forward, potentially developed into interest groups of their own on particular technologies. They could be taken forward and turned into working groups and so forth. But it's very much based on the kind of feedback we get to these sessions and the kind of ideas that people put forward. If it turns out to be a particularly rich seam of kind of information that we find we're mining, we may well work with you guys and see what we can do to take it forward. If it's kind of an interesting topic, but one that we feel we've covered enough, at least at the current state of play with what's going on in the wider world, might just leave it at that and just have that kind of information exchange. Topic of the day. So today we're going to be talking about applying PIDs at the institutional level. And Rory, if you just want to come up and say a couple of words before I take over again. Meanwhile, I will grab some water.
Thanks, James, and hi, everyone. I'm Rory McNeil, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the group. So yeah, today our topic is PIDs. More specifically, since our focus is on institutions, as James mentioned, it's applying PIDs at the institutional level. So what are some of the institutional issues that, the issues that institutions face in thinking about PIDs? So we all know there's a lot of, there's been a huge amount of work done, and there's an ARDC working group on national PID strategies. So there's a lot of work in Australia, in many ways leading the way in terms of thinking about PIDs at the national level, national policy, and then moving from policy to implementation. But in most cases, PIDs are going to be delivered or partially delivered at the institutional level. So there may be national policies, but how do those policies get translated into things which work for institutions, and how do institutions impact the way in which national policy is developed? Things to think about include the traditional PIDs, really DOIs, ORCIDs, ROARs, were really coming out of a publication-centric worldview. The new generation of PIDs have a focus more on data and physical things, so IGSNs, PIDinst, and RAID. So that has implications for delivery, among other things, at the institutional level. So which PIDs is an institution going to support? Is it all of the PIDs? Who's going to support it and how? Again, originally the PIDs were very much a kind of publication-centric, but that's no longer the case. That may have an implication on within the institution who is going to be supporting the development of particular PIDs. What role do PIDs play in the research infrastructure? And in one of the talks which we're going to hear later on from Sara El-Gebali at DataSite, that's something which her initiative is working on. So we'll hear a bit more about that later on. And then, of course, there's the fundamental issues of promotion and adoption. How do institutions think about promoting and adopting PIDs? And again, this may change with the new generation of PIDs as opposed to the traditional PIDs, something to think about there. And then, of course, there are cost issues to think about. So those are some of the things which we're looking forward to hearing what you think, but which occurred to us, which will impact on thinking about PIDs at the institutional level. Back to you, James.
Thank you very much, Rory. So our first presentation today is by Matt Chandler from Princeton, except unfortunately Matt could not make it. He found out last week that his department got no budget, so he couldn't come. He couldn't even attend virtually, so I am delivering his slides on his behalf, and hopefully I can do them justice and not mangle them too much. But if you do see me peering at the screen, that'll be so I can read the notes. So, contrasting incentives for infrastructure. So I should quickly reintroduce myself. So I'm James Wilson, I'm at University College London, and speaking to Matt about these, there's a lot that he's talking about and things that they're working on and issues they're facing at Princeton, which certainly, as somebody who works in infrastructure in another large research institution, feel very much common to me, and it'd be interesting to see how these ideas and so forth resonate with you at other institutions as well. But he starts off talking about this contrast between integration and interchange. And the value of PIDs is well understood for open science and research data ecosystems, but within institutions of higher education and academic research, there can be a lot of friction when it comes to PID adoption. And a lot of that has to do with these contrasting incentives for infrastructure. So in most large institutions, there tends to be an emphasis on integration, of trying to bring everything together to make it a coherent whole that works for that individual institution. There's obviously a drive to unify the vision and goals of the institution, to come up with centralized policies which apply across the institution, to co-design the kind of infrastructures worked on. This is not necessarily the kind of drivers, the kind of strategy into which PIDs fit very naturally. But the PIDs, of course, do really assist when it comes to matters of interchange, so particularly between institutions, where you can align concrete objectives, coordinate for mutual benefit between institutions, and establish interoperability. Obviously hugely important, particularly at a disciplinary level. Institutions don't necessarily work in that kind of pan-institutional level that many subject-specific researchers will do, where PIDs can solve many problems. Decentralization at universities. So large research universities are typically quite decentralized organizations, but that can sometimes appear to be the worst of both worlds. Between mismatches between the official policy and actual practice, you can end up with competition amongst different departments, cumbersome bureaucracies that tend to stifle change efforts. But it can also end up being an opportunity for the adoption of PIDs within universities. Less integration and more need for interchange within the institution can help to have solid external standards for unique identification of various entities across information systems. And that's especially true with research data in the wider context of Open Science Convention. So PIDs at Princeton. Princeton in the US, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it to some degree or another, is midway through a lengthy journey to integrate PIDs into internal record-keeping systems and interface with the global knowledge graph. And I think it's that second part of it that makes it a particularly interesting case study for this session. In this session, on Matt's behalf, I'm going to be highlighting two new products in which PIDs are key: ORCID at Princeton and Tiger Data. So ORCID at Princeton is almost self-explanatory. I think it's a standalone web application designed to encourage Princeton researchers to embrace ORCID IDs and establish the university as a trusted organization for ORCID accounts. I was having a chat with Matt before this, and he was keen to emphasize that at Princeton, as indeed at other institutions, I think, there's a sort of reluctance to come up with overarching policies that force researchers at the university to obey the rules, but rather to facilitate and make it easier to actually adopt the kind of technologies that they're looking to assist people to adopt. And that's very much the approach they're taking to encouraging people to pick up ORCIDs. Motivations are relatively straightforward in that Princeton wants to leverage ORCID to get a better handle on all of its research outputs. A lot of universities have that need. It can be quite hard to follow exactly what everyone's publishing. ORCIDs are a way to do that. Various offices within Princeton have been trying for years to tell faculty and other researchers that having an ORCID is a brilliant idea and they should all get them, but the success of doing so has been limited. External demands from some funders and publishers have actually been a stronger incentive for a lot of individuals to actually go and create their ORCID accounts, but adoption has been patchy. So the ORCID at Princeton portal was basically developed in order to facilitate greater and more consistent adoption. And according to the slide, it's having the desired effect. So a big increase in adoption when they first went live with it. It has somewhat tailed off a little bit since then. So I'm told that the target the number of people with ORCIDs at Princeton they're aiming for is about 5,000. So there's still quite a long way to go. And it has slowed up a little bit. And nobody there, I think, is expecting this to be an overnight success. It is going to be a gradual process. The other component that I'm going to be talking about is Tiger Data. This is Princeton's newish research data management platform. It combines a massive increase in storage hardware with customized tools and services to assist researchers organize, describe, collaborate on active research projects. So if you're a bit of a sort of a geek like I am, the previous system that they had before this came along was a mixture of on-prem sort of hardware, lots of NAS drives, lots of GPFS storage, and a bit of a free choice amongst the research community of Office 365, Google Docs, Dropbox, and a host of other things. They're trying to centralize a little bit more on a vastly increased new sort of on-premise infrastructure based largely on object storage and some NAS boxes thrown in for good measure. It's a relatively cool layer of storage. They are looking longer term to integrate that with hotter storage as well, but for the time being it's a cool one, but it hugely increases the capacity to deal with projects that have big data requirements, multi-terabyte data. They're taking a project as the fundamental unit that links everything else together and enables create this kind of network linked by PIDs. People only have roles in relation to projects. Files only exist within a project. Every project has standard metadata. There's a DOI for each project, and a lot of the data is based on the data site sort of schema. I think it's a slightly adapted version of it, but you'd need to ask Matt exactly how that's been adapted. But there was a deliberate choice to have a DOI at the project level rather than, say, a RAID, because they wanted the project to be considered as a digital object in its own right. Whether that's a good choice or not is perhaps an issue that the audience might want to come back to. Metadata for Tiger Data projects employs a generic model for PIDs inspired by DataCite. I think I've covered a lot of this already. Oh, worth mentioning that there are RAWs for users and for funding references. So that's the PID of choice being connected to the DOI for the project. At the moment, Princeton are only allowing their own internal researchers to use the system, so there's not really a need for the RAW yet in terms of the people, but that is going to be a change that is forthcoming, and they will enable external collaborators to work on projects as well. And in terms of the sort of other references that you see below, that can really be any sort of standard, normally acknowledged persistent identifier that can be linked to that to build those associations with other projects, other digital objects, so forth. And it's all based on an XML database under the hood, so it's not a relational model or anything like that. It does enable sort of expansion and moving into towards that kind of graph database kind of model. This is the graph of the uptake of Tiger data use. So as you can see, again, it's growing quite quickly. I think a lot of people at the moment are moving data from existing projects and so forth into the new Tiger data system, but it's also getting new adopters as well and growing quite rapidly. As with a lot of new infrastructure, Matt points out, it's easy to fall back on the idea of having local database IDs rather than sticking with kind of global persistent identifiers as the way of doing things. But the technical teams are all committed to sustainable research data management, and there's a significant need for interchange between different systems in the Tiger data ecosystem. It's not obvious to everyone who touches Tiger data why PIDs are so important, but the way they're doing it is trying to, if anything else, help normalize the use of persistent identifiers in the university context, and that seems to be having an effect. One thing to stress is the importance of buy-in from senior people around the university. So many different administrative units are buying into the concept of persistent identifiers. Makes a huge difference. The Dean of Libraries and the Dean for Research have also both shown significant commitment to the idea, the architectures. The Office of Information Technology also has skin in the game. It's a bit piecemeal in these early stages, but it's working for these products so far, and the precedent for coordination on PID usage is strengthening. I get the impression that it's a process of normalization as much as anything for the use of PIDs within the institution and trying to illustrate the benefits that can be brought about by doing so. Expectations going forward are, as Matt says, realistic. There's a lot of inertia, and I'm sure that those of you who work in large research universities will be familiar with that. Lots of incentives to avoid disruption. It is a decentralized environment. Not every academic department is going to be equally enthusiastic, equally bought into the idea. It needs to kind of spread gradually, and people need to become convinced of the benefits of doing it. Lots of different work cultures, different systems that people use, all the usual things that you would expect from a big university. So it's like to be an organic evolution. Change is going to be incremental, it will be inconsistent, there will probably be at some point some people saying, well, we don't really see the benefit of this, we're just going to do this system, or who simply haven't been looped in enough and have decided to go their own way, but good positive signs at the moment. And Matt says thank you, and so do I. Thank you, everyone. Now, I suppose we can probably fit one or two questions in. The only potential problem with the question now is that I might not be able to answer anything. So, I don't know, maybe Does anybody have a burning question which they think I might realistically be able to answer about these slides? Otherwise, we'll just move on to the next presentation and we'll discuss all of the ideas in the main section of the... Okay, I'm quite relieved, I think, actually, that there's no one who's put their hands up, because I think I've said all I probably can. But this does give me a good opportunity to move on to pass the baton back to Rory. Yes, if you want to use the clicker, that's there.
Okay, well, I'm back, and this time I have another persona, Sara El-Gebali from DataSite. It's I think it's like 4:30 in the morning now in Sweden, so she wasn't attending the conference. We thought it would be a bit much to ask her to do it virtually, so she's kindly agreed to provide a presentation, and like James, I'm going to be standing in for her and presenting. I'm happy to say that our final speaker is actually herself. She's representing herself instead of representing someone else. So you'll get to see someone else besides me and James. Okay, so let's, for the purposes of, I'm going to do it a little bit differently from James. I'm going to kind of pretend that I'm Sara instead of taking a step outside Sara. So hi, everyone. I'm Sara El-Gebali, metadata specialist at DataSite, and I'm part of the PID coordination hub, which is developed under PID for NFDI. As I think most people in the room probably know, the NFDI is an important national infrastructure initiative, which is really building infrastructure for Germany. So it's a national project. And the hub aims to standardize PID usage, enhance governance, and support interoperability across Germany's NFDI consortia. And this is the team. Sarah's there she is. There's Sara. So this is the PID coordination hub. This is a bit of a busy slide, but the PID coordination hub is built as a central entry point for anyone in the NFDI. So in effect, anyone in the NFDI, and then in effect anyone in Germany who's involved in repositories, consortia, or institutions. And maybe I should just step back for a moment and say that unlike the other two presentations, this one is not directly institution-centric, although I think many of the things which Sarah's working on and her group is working on have important implications for institutions. It's not really looking at it at the institutional perspective. It's things which institutions might want to consider. So the vision for the hub is to make PID adoption consistent, community-driven, and sustainable. In practice, this means different things for different groups. And that means different things for different groups, so repository managers, data stewards, et cetera, will each hopefully be able to get different things from the hub. So I'm not really going to focus on the next couple of things. I'm not really going to focus on. So Sarah's group is working on several things. I'm going to focus on the last one, but they're also providing some just kind of informational services. So that's one of the things that they're doing. They're also involved in training and capacity building. Again, I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. I think the last thing that she's doing, her group is doing, is probably the most relevant to institutions. And in fact, there was a workshop in Berlin 3 weeks ago, I think, which I attended, which was very interesting, which was really focused on the third thing that they're doing, which is metadata relating to metadata interoperability and collaboration. So as Sara says, let's now move from policy to practice. How can we make PIDs, how can PIDs actually make metadata interoperable across the research lifecycle? So now we're stepping down a bit from kind of Matt's overall institutional storage perspective and looking at more active use of PIDs during the active phase of the research life cycle. That's really the focus of what Sara's doing. So metadata throughout the research life cycle moves through systems and transformations, and keeping track of the flow is essential if we want true interoperability and reuse of data. So a typical research project moves through a data management plan at the start, again, not in every case, but in many cases, then through an electronic lab notebook during data collection, and a repository when results are shared. So the same information keeps getting used repeatedly, using different terms or identifiers by different people, project lead, creator. Sometimes an ORCID will be involved, sometimes it's just a name. But there's a lot of, right now there's no coordination. It's pretty chaotic. And every mismatch in this application of metadata costs precision, time, and context. And that's what PID interoperability potentially can fix, and that's what Sara's group is focused on. And in particular, they've taken two categories of tools, data management planning tools and electronic lab notebooks. And each has its own data model. They don't really talk to each other very well at the moment. So right now at the moment, if there's any effort at interoperability, the developers of the tools build in their own plugins or hard-coded mappings, which is fragile and hard to maintain. That's for individual tools. If you multiply that across dozens of systems and different PID providers, you get a web of one-off integrations that break whenever one component changes. So certainly that's difficult enough for big institutions like Princeton and UCL. For smaller institutions, there's no way they can possibly keep up with this constantly changing scene for the research infrastructure that their researchers are using. So even when PIDs exist, they often stay siloed in one system, disconnected from the rest of the research life cycle. So that's kind of the state of, not the state of the art, but the state of the nation, the state of the situation at the moment, if you will. So the vision that Sara's team is working on, and they're working on with another group, which I'll mention in a moment, TS for NFDI, which is Terminological Services. It's another one of the FDI groups, is interoperability by design. So instead of trying to do interoperability after the fact, build in interoperability by design. And you can see some of the groups that are involved in, whoops, didn't get that. There we go, sorry. So you can see some of the organizations that are involved in the project on this slide. So again, the hub, the PID coordination hub, brings together NFDI basic services and expects to connect and build, not to reinvent. So they're working with existing DMP infrastructures, existing ELN providers and repository managers, and in particular the terminology service and the NFDI metadata task force to make PID-enabled interoperability happen. So instead of mapping every system to every other schema, they map the project they're involved is to map everything to one canonical schema. So we call this approach map once, reuse everywhere. So everything is normalized to a canonical schema, in our case, the DataCite metadata model. And then, and this is really the core of the project, working with the Terminological Services group, we then build crosswalks linking DataCite fields to schema.org, DCAT, and templates used by, DLN and DMP tools. And so this is where the collaboration with TS for NFDI is crucial. They have a terminology and mapping infrastructure that makes this vision attainable. And I think, having been in the workshop a couple of weeks ago, that it could actually be true that it's attainable. It's certainly something which they have it's well under development, I would say. So the tool that TS for NFDI is developing is called COCODA. It's a web app for managing and publishing mappings between vocabularies, taxonomies, and metadata schemas. And together, the two groups are integrating these crosswalks into a single shared service, which will be accessible through an API. So the idea is that if you have a data management planning tool which is using one schema, and an electronic lab notebook which is using another, and a repository which is using another, they can, through the crosswalks, they'll be able to communicate with each other. It's a pretty simple idea. Again, achieving it, we'll see how successful it is, but that's the plan. Sarah, I'm editorializing now. I'm no longer Sarah, I'm Rory, but I'll jump back in and try to be Sarah again. And actually, so this last slide is really the summary again. So they're working on creating, reviewing, and managing the crosswalks, and some of the ones that I mentioned, schema.org, DCAT, and DataSite. Then these mappings will be stored centrally in a way that's both human readable and machine actionable. And then they'll be published through an API so that any DMP tool, ELN, or repository can query what's the mapping for this DataSite field. So, thank you very much. Whoops. Amberyn, you going to come up? Yeah.
Hi, everyone. This is me, and I am me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the PID implementation at the University of Queensland, which is an institution just down the river, up the river from here. And I'm speaking in my capacity as the Director of Research Environment. I report through to the Office of the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Research. But a lot of what I have to say today actually reflects on activity that is really led strongly by the library. So I've got my library colleagues, Justine and Michael, also on the slide. And some of this work began when I worked in the library, and I've been in the Director of Research Environment for just over a year now. And like quite a few things that I was doing in the library, some of those things have followed, which is why I'm still find myself talking about PIDs. So the first thing that I thought might be useful is to position an institutional PID implementation in terms of a university strategy. So it's really important to get whole of university buy-in in order to do this successfully. So at the University of Queensland, like most universities, we have a strategy, obviously, and we have something called the research roadmap. There's 4 pillars to the roadmap, and the PID strategy actually supports all 4 pillars in some way. So it's easy to distill PIDs down just to enable linking of data, but I think it's important to go much further in what a PID strategy can do for the university in a much more holistic sense over the long term than to talk about it in that linked data way. So looking at our research roadmap, these are the 4 pillars, but you can see within those pillars there's things like responsible research, there's research impact, there's collaboration, and there's research infrastructure. All those things matter, and all of those things are relevant in the context of PIDs. You'll also see on the right-hand slide a lot of external things that impact our decision to embrace a PID strategy or a PID implementation plan. So we at the University of Queensland were really early adopters of ORCID. So back in 2013, we got straight into integrating ORCIDs with our institutional repository, UQ eSpace. A few words about that repository. So it is something that is managed and developed by the UQ library. So it's a bespoke system. So it's not a vendor solution. They have developers in-house in the library, and that's actually underpins a lot of the success with that ORCID implementation. We also were instigators of the idea of RAID, and we were involved in the beta version of RAID, but it's since moved on quite a lot under the ARDC. We're currently not using RAID for a number of reasons, but we have the ability to roll that back up quite quickly if we want to. We mint DOIs for research outputs. We also, including both Crossref and DataSite ones. We use DOIs for instruments, and we make use of RAW. So when we mint a DOI for a research output, we'll include the institutional RAW in the payload, as well as the ORCIDs, and we make sure that ORCID is integrated. So ORCID was a real success story for UQ because it was run as a whole of university strategically funded project over a number of years, a couple of years in two different phases. And just in terms of its success, we're currently sitting at around about 88% of UQ academic staff have an ORCID that's linked to UQ systems. We've never aimed for anything close to 100 because of the people on short-term contracts. There's really no point in us getting their ORCID and making them go through that effort. It's mentioned in our policy, so our HDR, higher degree by research students, have to have an ORCID, it's mandated, but for academic staff it's just strongly recommended in our authorship policy. So there's some drivers there from a policy setting piece as well. The reason that one of the reasons that the ORCID implementation has been so successful is that it's managed within that institutional repository, but the authenticated ORCID is made available in other systems via APIs. So in near real time, it appears in our identity management system as an eduperson attribute. We're one of only 3 universities in Australia that have that available as an eduperson ORCID attribute within the AAF. So it's a fairly sophisticated implementation and that level of sophistication isn't actually leading to other flow-on benefits at the moment because it's not been implemented to that level of maturity in other places. Some of the key learnings, I think, from our ORCID implementation is that it does take that whole of university approach in order to do it. So you need senior sponsorship and it does require investment. I think we spoke about the benefits of ORCID in ways that resonated with different stakeholders, so everyone from your individual researcher through to those in higher levels. We made sure that we promoted ORCID and promoted the best practice use of ORCID in publishing. We also made sure that we let people know about the benefits of ORCID as it mattered to them, and we've leveraged it to make it easier for researchers. So we've tried as best we can to make sure that ORCID implementation actually delivers benefits for the individual researcher because they're the people who really need to be the ones using it. And the other really key thing is that we plan for business as usual at project close phase. So who's responsible for the ongoing implementation? The same cannot be said for the way we started doing instrument PIDs. So this is going back over a year now. We had a lot of interest to do a DOI for Bunya, our supercomputer. And under pressure from the people who run this, we did mint a DOI for them and we warned them it's not a good idea to send that to a web page. Within a day, that was giving an error. It wasn't resolving properly. We fixed it. But that was just something that we did as a suck it and see. We've now got a much more mature implementation for instruments within the repository, and here I have to acknowledge again the library colleagues, and in particular Michael Feeney, who has done this work. And the way that's currently working at the moment is we're using a DataCite DOI with a PID-inst metadata schema, and I believe there's some work underway working with the ARDC to make sure that that's also mapped to the RIF-CS schema. So there's lots of opportunities for PIDs within within an institution, but more importantly, in order for us to get the real benefits, we require the whole ecosystem to work together and all of the PIDs to link together. So a lot of integrity is required in the system, and I think this is actually the biggest challenge that we currently face. So it only takes one break in that chain and suddenly all of the effort it doesn't deliver the benefits that it should. And we've absolutely found this with ORCID. So we put a lot of effort into the ORCID implementation, but because others, particularly publishers, some of the infrastructure providers and the data providers, haven't put that same level of effort in, that system isn't really delivering the benefits to the researcher without institutional investment. So we resource that to make sure that we support our researchers have their ORCIDs curated, but if there was a much stronger ecosystem, then that curation would be a lot lighter touch. You might, so just By way of example, what you'll see at the bottom there is some metadata from Crossref for a Wiley publication. They do provide ORCIDs, so they use ORCIDs in their manuscript submission system, but they're not flagging in Crossref, for example, whether that's an authenticated ORCID or not. The authenticated flag is set to false. So in order to maintain, you really need a trusted ecosystem of PIDs in order to deliver the value long term. You may wonder why I've got a cow on the slide. The cow is really because I struggle sometimes because in the beef industry in Australia, we are now addressing the concerns of the EU deforestation regulation, where you have to prove that the meat that's we export into the EU isn't resulting in any sort of land clearing, deforestation. So that requires a really sophisticated provenance of the meat on the table back through that cow's life, including transport, food, all sorts of things. So if this kind of provenance across a really complicated value chain, I suppose, can be done in the beef industry globally, I just don't understand why we can't make more inroads with PIDs in an area where the sector should be really advanced in the way we deal with this kind of thing, and it just seems to be taking a lot more effort than I think it should. So where to from now? So we have, as an institution, considered PID implementation. There's lots of talk about it being really important. So what's actually required in order to do this well? These are my thoughts entirely. We need to make sure that we've got endorsement at that strategic level for the priority PIDs. We need to establish governance, so we need to make sure that we don't just say it, but that we build in some kind of strategic and senior oversight of that, and then we can develop an action plan. So at the moment things are happening because we've got people in the library who are really passionate and really clever and making it work, but it hasn't got that institutional oversight other than for ORCID. There are risks with investing too much into PIDs at the moment, I think, because of that lack of other institutions, vendors, data providers, infrastructure providers having mature implementations. So I think that if there's anything here, it's a call to action for everyone to do their bit. But beyond that, we know that there's other efforts underway to use generative AI to link different artefacts of research across the research lifecycle. So I think from an institutional perspective, we shouldn't put all our eggs in the PID basket, but we should take a really mature approach and consider other things that can also help us build an understanding of how research is linked together and different artefacts of research are linked together. All my thoughts, that last line. Thank you.
Sorry, is that better? Yeah, as I was saying, been talking to a lot of institutions across the Australian landscape, including government, universities, and they want to uplift to adopt PIDs, but their current infrastructure and native schema are preventing them from doing that. How do you sell the benefits to the people that need to invest in those organisations the way that you have?
Look, I don't know. I think that is the challenge. We don't have that same challenge because we've got our own system. So we've not only got our own repository system, eSpace, that's developed, and people who are deeply engaged in this and very active in making sure progress happens. We've also got our own research data manager, the UQRDM. So we've got another developer team that actually sits in the research office that it's kind of like an integrated data management plan, if you like, or an actionable DMP that also has a role to play in things like RAIDs as well. So we've got like this in-house capability to start doing some of these newer things. I think when you have vendor products, it's much harder, other than doing it collaboratively and providing, collectively putting pressure on those infrastructure providers to provide the mechanisms to make it sophisticated. But I think that's actually the challenge that people have.
Any other questions? Yep, Malroy. And please introduce yourself for the virtual audience.
Hello everyone, I'm Melroy from the Australian Access Federation. Not necessarily a question, but just a comment to the previous question. So with vendors, what we've seen in the past is those organizations that do have vendor systems, if they approach the vendor individually, they generally get knocked back. However, it's not just one organization that is using those systems. There are multiple organizations that all have those same sort of systems, same vendor systems. And if it's an issue for one, it would probably be an issue for most of them. The question is, we do need to talk among ourselves, and one of the things that we do, at least with the Australian ORCID Consortium, is we have chats with our members, those that all have similar sort of systems, to see if there's things that we can take back to the vendor as a group rather than doing it individually. And what that means is there is a greater reason for the vendor to actually act on it if there's more than one organization actually asking for a certain sort of change, I guess.
Thanks, Melroy.
I might just make a comment in response to what Melroy had to say, to say that there is still value for institutions making their own decisions around PID, so it can deliver value even without the global ecosystem. And I think in terms of getting executive sponsorship of a PID implementation, it's really important to be able to articulate that. So even if globally PIDs don't get the uptake and the integrity that they really should have, even being able to do it within your own university systems will enable things like understanding return on investment in infrastructure, enable a full provenance of research impact, so you know how that comes about. So I think it's about understanding why you're doing what you're doing and what the first steps need to be, but collectively it would obviously be much better. So yeah, finding out where we're all similar is probably also really valuable.
Thanks, Amberyn. Yep, question? Yvette.
Kia ora, Yvette from University of Auckland. I kind of have two questions. One is around, you mentioned sort of looking at things like impact. So have you done anything looking at things like the research graph, so that kind of wider impact and interconnections? And then the second is, what sort of thinking have you got in the instrument DOIs or PID-inst sort of space?
In answer to your first question, yes, a little bit. But I think that's actually the area where AI has potential to link things together and tell interesting stories with different digital artefacts. In terms of the instrument PIDs, we've got that capability in the repository now. So I'm channeling my colleague Michael, who I was talking to online this morning about this. So they have now one live record. That record is really just an exemplar. It's a real record. It's using the PID-inst schema, but data site DOIs. That's that's the limit of my technical knowledge of how that implementation is working, other than there is ongoing discussions to make sure that it flows through to Research Data Australia, so discussions making sure it meets the RIF-CS schema. The next steps for that instrument PID work is we have one group, the CMM, Centre for Microscopy and Microanalysis, who are very interested in having instrument records. So we will be working with that group initially. So even in the absence of that whole of university approach and whole of university approach for the endorsement of the priority PIDs, we can pick off an organisational unit that's really motivated and work with them. So that, I believe, is the plan, but I'm just going to ask Justine if that actually is the plan. That is the plan.
Okay. Oh, yes. There you go.
Hi, Christine Street from CSIRO. You said that HDR students, it's mandated to have an ORCID, and with researchers it's opt-in, but you do encourage it. What's compliance like there as far as researchers go? What's the uptake?
For researchers, we're sitting at 87% have an authenticated ORCID in our system. So many more of them have ORCIDs. They just haven't bothered to actually go through the process of linking it. But 100% of HDR students do, because they can't proceed. It's like a hardwired thing. They can't submit their thesis without it.
Thanks, Amberyn. Any other questions for Amberyn before we move on to discussion? Okay, well, in that case, first of all, do you mind joining me in thanking Amberyn for her presentation and providing the insights that you could? James, if you want to run around with the mic. So, thank you for those different perspectives, and it's quite interesting to hear all the different scenarios and different situations at the universities, and also that interchange between a national PID landscape and an institutional translation of that. So we'd like to, as we were preparing for this session, there were a number of questions that came up in our mind, thinking, well, what are the challenges that institutions are facing? So one of the first questions I wanted to ask, and it already came up a little bit in Matt's presentation, but also in Amberyn's presentation, is what are the drivers in your institution? Are there key bits of the institution you can pick out and identify and say, well, that's a good place to start? Those are parts of the institution that will be key drivers in driving this forward and taking this forward. So does anybody have any first-hand experience there, or things they would like to share on parts of the institution that are able to drive that PID agenda and the adoption?
Hello everyone, Melra again. I can't talk to it from a specific institution perspective because I'm not with any university, but when as part of the Australian ORCID Consortium, one of the things we've noticed is the department, or within a university, the department that leads it is the one that has the most to do with it. So sometimes it could be libraries, because that is where all those persistent identifiers sit, that's where your DOIs sit, that's where they look at their researches. All that information gets added into their repositories. At some universities, it is the research office, because that's where all the research reporting takes place, that it carries a lot more importance. There are some places where it's both the libraries and the research office. So it just depends as to who is the one, as in which department is effectively the custodian of that information, and they are the ones, I would say, that have the most to gain in trying to lead this sort of initiative.
James, do you have a reflection from UCL?
Yeah, a we are looking at projects to link data and enhance and enable fair digital objects. So whilst we haven't really made much progress yet in terms of applying PIDs in practice, it is likely to be the IT department who are doing this because we have interests in promoting fair digital objects, but we do work very closely as well with our library team, and we use DOIs for our existing research data repository, which is a shared enterprise. So I think you're probably right, and it's the department with the most interest that drives the adoption, but that's not necessarily purely research office libraries. Could even be an academic department. We have some of our chemists who are very interested in linking instruments that generate their data with ELNs, so it wouldn't surprise me too much. Given the decentralized nature of some universities, some people just go off and do it because they're enthusiasts and they're champions and they want to try things out. But I expect you're almost certainly right, it would usually be libraries or research offices who would be drivers. Does anybody have any other perspectives?
Kate, any experiences from UWA?
Hi, I'm Kate from UWA and I work in the library. So we've had ORCIDs for quite a long time, similar to UQ, and obviously work with DOIs on a regular basis as well. And we're now working very closely with our Research Facilities Committee to investigate raids, but also we've also done some work in the instrument space. And now separately I'm getting approached from longitudinal studies to also investigate PIDs as well. So it's kind of started in the library, but now we're finding other elements of the university are coming to us.
So, I think there's a hand at the back. Yeah. Hopefully this will get James over his jet lag, a bit of running around.
Maybe some exercise. Yeah, just wanted to share. So my name is Manuel from the Helmholtz Association in Germany. So we are part of the LFDI stuff that Bobby presented. One of the big reasons why we use PIDs is actually to harmonize bibliographic information across different institutes that we have. So we are smaller than Germany, but we're much bigger. We have 18 very large institutions. So we're using to be able to compare information across different institutions that PIDs come in very handy. And the other part where we do have a lot of collaboration across institutions is with actually PID-INSTs, because we had different instrument databases, and to harmonize these databases, PID-INSTs are actually very, very useful. Also because they give you a handle on what was actually measured. You don't get that by the instrument directly, but you get an idea of what was measured. And that's actually beyond bibliographic data. That goes into exploratory data, which then helps you much more in evaluating and using the data with kind of scientific information, which most of the PIDs currently do not cover. They do not cover what was measured, they do not cover parameters, methods, and so on. But that's where we ultimately want to go. And yeah, so PIDs are quite on the path.
So just, is that Yvette? Are you raising? Yes, Yvette's raising her hand. Yes, there we are.
Of course I have a comment. Kia ora everyone, Yvette again. I was just going to comment on talking about some of the challenges, thinking institutionally. One of the things in planning for all of this, we have to consider the age of our systems, and as our systems are kind of coming up for renewal, plan for bringing things like PIDs into the systems as they come through. So one of the, I guess you could call it hindrances we've had is because we have older systems that are coming up for replacement, and so kind of we have a vision of what, you know, our connected PID system can look like, but we have a few technical issues that we either have to work around or work towards. And I wondered how many other people were on a similar trajectory in terms of there is some buy-in and desire for PIDs, but there's some technological challenges that you have to work through and around as you get there.
Well, first of all, just a show of hands. Who's running into that problem? Technical systems not ready for it yet? I see one or two. Some careful hands. Yes, we won't identify you, don't worry. Does that limit then your priority setting? Do you work from priorities or do you work from systems?
I think for us, we work on what we can when we can, pragmatically. So sometimes we're not doing an optimal solution, but we're planning long term. So we're connecting the bits of a system or the pieces that we can, but not always the whole end to end at once. So, you know, we've been doing some work in the PIDs DOI space, connecting from our sort of register of our research assets into creating where we say yes, we want to create a DOI for this, creating that DOI and then surfacing it elsewhere, so it's then usable. But that's not the full end-to-end capability at the moment, and you know, wanting to have sort of a project identifier or RAID in there, but just not quite being ready to have that full pipeline. So we're just putting bits of plumbing in as we go, I think, and planning that, prioritising it when a system comes up.
So yeah, instruments are technical barriers and one thing, but the other one is actually the social barrier, is that if you mint a PID, you have to make somebody responsible for maintaining it. So we all know there's so many PIDs out there that even DOIs, even cluster DOIs that end up in nowhere. And that's because systems change and the PIDs have to be updated. So in my opinion, no PID should be issued without somebody responsible for it. But that's the hell of it, difficult. That's not easy, and I don't see a good solution for that other than really having institutional policies regulating that. And it starts very easily with the ROR, which we simply don't know the RORs of most of our institutions. We can search them in the ROR directory, but there's no official place where these are recorded where we can look them up. So we always have to guess, because there's nobody responsible. Right? It should be easy there.
I think I saw a hand there.
So I'm from Karlsruhe Institute of Technology and also part of the Helmholtz metadata collaboration and NFDI for material science and Mathwerk. So that's how the consortia is called. And at KIT, the library uses ORCID for quite a while now. So just to link publications. But we also have the problem of systems not really supporting PIDs. I'm personally working on PIDs as a harmonized representation on top of these systems. But we also have the problem that systems change, responsibilities change, and some people don't even want a PID. So that I don't understand why, but sometimes they don't want to change, want to have public metadata. They are unsure if they even want to have the data set they are collecting somewhere stored. And they don't want to reference it, they just want to have their hard drive and plug it into their computer. It's really strange what some people are doing and really interesting.
Thank you. Yes. So from institutions that have started that voyage of adopting PIDs, and I think that question about who's responsible then for that PID, not only while the researcher might still be in the institution, but also if the researcher then leaves the institution with that orphaned PID, who takes responsibility for that? Amberyn, can I put you on the spot? Do you have some reflections?
So, hello.
Yep.
Working? Oh, good. This was the example that I gave where we did mint DOI for the Bunya supercomputer because there was demand for it, and the DOI just resolved to a web page that was down within 24 hours. So we knew that that was a risk. It was one of the things that was kind of, we took that risk. It's been mitigated now. It's a fine link now. But governance, it's about ensuring good governance so that you build integrity into the system from the very beginning. And I think that that then means that you need to balance your speed of implementation with that making sure you do it once and you get it right. But you also need to capitalise on those people who are really interested. So you can't afford to lose traction when you've got people who want something. So there's a bit of a balance that you have to play there. The other thing, though, is that the last thing that we want in that broader PID system is just more dead links. So I think making sure, and this is where getting multiple stakeholders together is important, and getting people to, because people will naturally wear different hats. You don't want PIDs, I don't think you want PIDs within an institution to become like a cottage industry, where you have just a whole lot of, a free-for-all where everyone's doing their own thing. So you need to have advocates who can help stitch it together, and you need to be able to link the what's happening on the ground with the people who are the early adopters. You need to be able to bring them together and link it back up. So a bottom-up and a top-down approach together is what will get the best results, I think.
Thanks. Any reflections on that? So one of the questions, when we were preparing this session, we were talking to Matt at Princeton, and he was puzzling about, well, Princeton is a very decentralized university with a lot of decentralized responsibility, and he was puzzling about how on earth to deliver, to get that PID adoption across a decentralized institution. So is there any of you that feels that they are in a decentralized institution and run into challenges with that, or found maybe some possible approaches, ways to tackle that?
Those people at the extremes of the room who have their hand.
Yeah, we are actually, as I said, covering 18 institutions, and our approach on that is that we're simply writing up rules, or we call them recommendations, because we do not want to put them into clear policies, but we're writing up recommendations on, first of all, which PID types to apply, and then also how to apply them and how to assign responsibilities. That's why I mentioned that. Personally, I think that most people in our institutions, they do not want to make decisions themselves. They need guidance. They want somebody to tell them this is the way to go, and they expect from us to actually having reviewed the consequences and gain the support from the management, for example, but also from the infrastructures. And then following on that, we actually issue guidance and ask people, please go this way, don't go that way, apply kind of harmonized procedures, adopt procedures, and then we're all moving into the same direction. And that way, kind of, we are hoping to move the kind of gravity of mass towards common procedures. And that's for us the way to do that across institutions.
I would agree with Emmanuel on that. From the NFTIs, I can say that they want hosted solutions for that. So the scientists, material scientists, for example, they don't really care how they organize it. They just want it to work. They want a key-ready solution that solves their problems or does something they didn't even know it was a problem. So that's really the difference between us and the people that use and provide data in the end. So there are different perspectives on it.
So what are the things that will really get the researchers across the line? You mentioned the infrastructure. Anything else?
So I think also, just coming back, I'd maybe get James to comment on this, but James made, I don't know if I remembered, made an allusion to the chemistry department at UCL, which might be quite interested in developing PIDs. And there's been quite a bit of talk about PIDs here. So I think, again, if you look at the kind of traditional publication-focused PIDs, the orgs, the orchids, roars, they were kind of top-down imposed by the library usually. But some of the newer generation of PIDs, no one's mentioned IGSNs yet, but for samples, or PIDs are actually bottom-up. It's the actual research groups that want to get them. And I think James gave the example of chemistry at UCL might be an example of that. So I think it's going to be different for different kinds of PIDs. And I think one of the things that institutions can do is keep an eye out for the kind of bottom-up interest, and then opportunistically, if you will, capitalize on that. I don't know what you think, James.
Yeah, it's a good point. So we do have a team who are in our IT services who at UCL who have the job of updating all of the central registry of equipment, because I think the previous kind of institutional sort of naming system was required an update by GISC in the UK to maintain a kind of national database. And I found them in time and told them, hey, stop, go to another institutional one, use PIDs. This is the way that the world is moving, and it will make it much easier for everyone to track the provenance of the science that they're conducting. And a little meeting, lots of nodding of heads. But they went off and I've not had anything since, and I'm pretty sure that they haven't gone and done anything with PIDs. And it's not really, they're just a team who kind of do what they're told and use it the easiest way possible. And they don't really see the effects and the usefulness that these things can have on the research community, and actually the way you track research. And I think it is quite important to try and come up with these stories of how researchers themselves are interested in these things and how they can benefit, to try and sell the possibilities even to your own teams, because otherwise it's just a little bit of extra effort that people aren't paid any extra for, and they're inclined to take the simplest kind of redo the current system rather than actually innovate when they don't have that. There's been a case study of how particular researchers might benefit and see the benefits.
Okay, thanks. So notice that in 2 of the countries we're hearing from here, there are national PID strategies, either in existence or in development. In Germany, there's quite a lot happening. In Australia, there's quite a lot happening in that space. Is that helpful, or is that a hindrance? As in, from an institutional perspective, having a national PID strategy, does that get in the way, or does that actually progress it? And if so, how does that influence it? I think Melroy's got his hand up.
Thanks, Keith. With the national PID strategy, at least in Australia, I think it's helping universities. It's pulling everybody in the same sort of direction. One of the things behind the national PID strategy is there's a vision of what they would like to achieve in the future. And part of it in Australia now we're looking at is roadmaps. So how do we get to what we want to achieve, and what's the best way of getting there? And it might be different for different institutions, but everybody knows the direction that we are pulling in. And what that means is it provides that bit of guidance saying that if you want to do orchids well, these are some of the recommendations on how to do it. You want to do DOI for instruments, these are some of those recommendations on how you want to do it. You're looking at implementing RORs, this is what is expected to be done with regards to that. So what this means is it's not telling everyone this is how you need to do it and this is what you should do. These are guidances. This is, if you implement some of these, you'll get to a certain stage. If you implement all of it, you'll get to, you might progress a lot more than what you think you will. But having a national PID strategy or some sort of national strategy, what that means is it provides guidance to everyone else within that particular country, I guess, is we are all pulling in one direction, and it provides you with that sort of guideline or framework on how to get to the eventual destination.
We're certainly getting you your exercise, aren't we?
I'm just going to pick up on what Melroy said, and I think that a national PID strategy is really important, but it can't be the only thing that happens nationally, and it can't be, it's not in itself enough to make an institution engage, and that's where I think we need to understand the longer term, in terms of that longer term vision, it's about what benefits will this deliver that resonate for the different stakeholders required to make it work. And if there's some, I think in terms of Australia's national PID strategy, it's now got a little bit of oomph because the ARC, the Australian Research Council, now have announced their own PID implementation plan, albeit a fairly cut back version, but there needs to be a few more drivers for institutions to actually invest the resources that are needed to make this work. There need to be multiple things need to align, I think. And that obviously is a challenge because it's a really crowded space at the moment. So the bandwidth for, no matter how compelling the message, the bandwidth for senior leaders in particular is very small. So there's nothing quite like an external compliance requirement to catalyse investment and resources and get people all pulling in the right direction. So the strategy's great, but on its own, it's unlikely to get the traction it needs. Just my opinion.
Yeah. Thanks, Amberyn. So definitely not the magical be-all, end-all solution. So for all those countries that don't happen to have one, yes, it's not the be-all, end-all. It's a start. Yes, thanks.
Hi, my name is Olivier Rouchon. I work in France in CNRS, probably the largest research performing organization in France. So we do have a national policy being implemented at the moment, focusing on different PIDs such as ORCID, RAW, DOIs, things like that. So that will simplify the landscape because we've got a pretty unique situation in France where a research unit or laboratory can be managed by 2 or 3 different institutions, a university, a research performing organization, which means that it could well be that a researcher has got many different ideas based on the organization he belongs to, a university, CNRS, things like that. The biggest problem we have at CNRS is a problem of scale because we've got 20,000 researchers, 10,000 engineers, 1,100 units or laboratories. So how do we manage the creation and the management of those ideas? It's sometimes a voluntary effort from researchers to create their own ORCID. So we need to work on a policy to harmonize the information that they put in the registry so that it's coherent at the organization level. So that's the challenge we have for the coming months or maybe year.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Okay, looking at the time, we're coming to the end of the session. I'd like to invite James up to sort of wrap it up, and also to probably ask the question, what does this mean for the ARDC interest group? And are there any further avenues here? So, James, for you.
Thank you very much. Try and figure out how to turn this microphone off. I think I've achieved that. Right, so that was a very interesting conversation. And I say that as somebody who's in a position where I might be able to do something at a fairly large research university, but we haven't really begun the journey yet. And one of the things that's highlighted to me is just hearing how other people have started off doing things, not only from the Matt's presentation that I was given, but the other presenters, and some of the comments here is I can now go back to UCL with some ideas as to how we might actually start to try and affect things in practice. But it's not all about me and how much I've benefited from it. It's very much about how you guys have as well, and what we might want to do next. So I suppose the key things are, from what we've heard, some of the benefits about having maybe national policies, ideas about roadmaps, how to begin these kind of developments, what the potential benefits are, who the stakeholders might be, potentially bringing in people from the research community who might benefit from PIDs, potentially in the manner of being able to trace provenance of data. Where do we take it? Do we say that was very interesting, I feel enlightened or otherwise? Or are there particular things which we can potentially take forward from this conversation and think about maybe producing some recommendations and guidelines if people are interested in that, whether we move on to a different topic? People have suggestions or ideas, things that you might be interested in being involved in. Now would be a time to mention them. Now we need another mic bearer, sorry.
Yeah, so I just want to promote one of the approaches we are currently doing. In the RDA, we formed a community of practice, which is for the earth and environment, which is where I come from. But I think, at least for the RDA, from the RDA perspective, we have to make the shift from basically issuing recommendations to actually taking a look how do we get them into practice, because many of the recommendations offer a number of implementation possibilities, which is obviously not what we want. So we need to get a handle on how do we implement these things. And personally, I think community practices are the way to go, and we all should look beyond our little plate where we are operating to take a look what are others doing and where do the communities move to, and that's what we have to find out. That's what we have to promote, and I think that's also what we could do here. But the bigger the group, obviously, the better we can judge that. So community of practice, that would be nice.
And I guess community practices are one of the things that we can do. I think because we are running out of time and I need to wrap up a bit more, if people who have hopefully been accessing the collaborative notes, which I completely forgot to mention in the intro, but you should find links in there. If people want to, if you haven't already opened it up and kind of put your name down and the fact that you've been attending, but make if at the bottom of the collaborative notes, if people who are interested in taking these kind of things forward, starting to figure out how to make a slightly more formalized community, want to add suggestions, add their names or anything there, that's probably a good first step before we wrap up today. Keith, do you have any other suggestions as being a very much an embedded RDA expert?
No, so I think that would be a good way forwards. If we can set up a community, anybody that's interested in forming a community of practice, please add your names to the collaborative notes document. If you can't find it, please come to the front after the session and we'll make sure you can find it. Just one little plug while we're at it. ARDC's commissioned a report from Digital Science looking at benchmarking for sort of like a benchmarking tool for institutions that want to adopt PIDs and apply PIDs. So that's going to be released, I think, in the next week. So keep your eyes peeled for that one. And that might be a helpful tool for institutions that are considering implementing PIDs.
Super. So thanks everyone for attending. Thanks everyone for your input, all the brilliant ideas, the comments you've made, and yeah, go forth and enjoy the rest of IDW, RDA, you know, whichever sessions you're most interested in. But thank you very much.